for continuing on our staff professional development conference journey today. You are joining the session Addressing Food and Housing Insecurity Among Students. The presenters for this session are Annika Sikink, the Employee Development and Engagement Coordinator with Campus Enterprise, and Dr. Mary Haskett, Professor of Psychology there with NC State University. Many of our students struggle with food and housing insecurity, and in this session, you will learn about new community initiatives like host homes that can address basic needs and explore how any CRC staff or faculty member can get involved to promote student success. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our presenters.
Good morning, everyone. Annika and I are excited to have this opportunity to talk with you all today, and we most definitely want to have some engagement. So we're going to have some time set aside for breakout sessions where we can do some brainstorming together. And so we're looking forward to the session. Again, thank you for being here. Next slide. So this is just a very brief agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about the challenge of food and housing insecurity among college students. And then we're going to talk about what we're doing at NC State that we think can be replicated on other campuses. And we'll talk about a specific initiative to prevent college student homelessness that's in the early stages of development here in Wake County. And then we're going to have this discussion about next steps. So we're going to start this morning very intentionally by hearing from 3 students who have direct experiences with food and housing and financial insecurity. This was a film that was produced here at NC State by Diane Nyland. So Annika will share that video with us.
And Mary, when I get it started here, can you give me a heads up that we have sound? Just a thumbs up.
Yes, thank you.
Because they don't see you sleeping on a park bench. They don't see your issue as important. You gotta prepare for people not to see your issues.
I'm not exactly sure what the health insurance actually does for me. I know that it doesn't include dental insurance. I had a filling come out. For the past 2 months, I haven't gotten that filled because in addition to having no time, I basically don't have money for that.
Like I said, even as a low-income student, especially coming from Charlotte, if you look at the statistics, I shouldn't be here. I ran out of money from the semester because, you know, you get those refund checks if you're getting financial aid. And I wasn't getting paid for the 24-hour desk until like a week later. I had enough money to go up to Gumby's Pizza and buy an extra large pizza, and I ate off that pizza for a week.
My weak moment of wanting to give up was just when I was working so much. And obviously, like, I would snap right back and be like, well, I can get a better job if I get a degree, you know? But at the time, like, is it worth it? Is it worth, like, not sleeping? So I could go to class, go to my jobs, figure out times to study, and it was stressful, and I wanted to give up.
I'm not sure if what the eviction process or whatever would be like for this place, like if they would kick me out as a student. I would like to think people like me enough that they would let me live with them, you know, rather than actually live in my car. I have like few enough possessions here that that would increase the viability of that. Things always seem to work out, I guess.
So I've had a few friends who were homeless while being here. There are a lot of students who face a lot of similar issues that I do, if not even worse. And I've seen how chronic stress affects your life.
I want to live my life too. I want to be with my friends. I want to do things I'm passionate about. But I want to do good in school, and I have to work.
So the experiences of Bryce and Jamal and Indira are not unusual. Here's a bit of a national perspective. There was a study done in fall of 2020 by the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice. That center is led by Sarah Goldrick-Rabb, and she's really the national leader in this work. In her survey of about 200,000 students, these students came from 202 institutions of higher ed across 42 states. And in that study, there was a 14% rate of homelessness in the past year, and a rate of food insecurity in the past 30 days of 34%. There is a little bit of variability between community colleges and four-year institutions in these rates. And students in community colleges tend to experience homelessness and food insecurity at a little bit higher rate. And those rates are shown on the slide. This slide also includes a PDF of the full report for your interest. We also know from a local perspective that these rates are comparable here in Wake County. In fall of 2020, my research team conducted a study of NC State University students. About 75% of them were undergrad and 25% grad students. And we found rates of homelessness comparable to national levels, 15% since the pandemic began. And these data were collected about 7 months into the pandemic. And then a 30-day time frame for food insecurity. We found a 23% rate, so slightly lower than national levels. And I'm happy to send these a report of these data to you if you're interested in more information. On the next slide, give you a little bit of a sense of students' experiences during the pandemic. In the column on the far right, the data in black font is for students who had not experienced food and housing insecurity. And the numbers, the percentages in blue are for students who had experienced either food and or housing insecurity. And what you can see is that students are working hard and doing all that's expected of them to pay for their college degree. They are applying for and receiving grants, the maximum of financial aid that they can receive. They are working and looking for work at the same time. So many of the students, particularly those who are food and housing insecure, are sort of chronically looking for additional jobs. The pandemic was having a personal impact. 56% of our general population of students were categorized as having poor wellness. And that was even higher for students who had experienced food and housing insecurity. There was an academic impact as well, again, particularly for students who were struggling with food or housing. Interesting, students who were experiencing food and housing insecurity were giving to others who needed help with money, food, housing, transportation. 62% of students who were struggling were also helping others. And what this suggests to us is that if we are able to increase the resources for students who are struggling, those resources are going to go far because they're going to be sharing with others, either with their friends or with their family members. I'm going to end my portion of this presentation the way I started it, with student voices. And rather than read these quotes to you, I'm going to let you read them for just a second, and then we'll pass it on to Annika.
So I want to first of all begin by just acknowledging the pioneering work and effort that Mary has put into this, along with many other people on campus. But she has really been at the forefront of raising awareness of this issue at NC State, and continually badgering people, and in a good way, in a great way, to pay attention to this and to think about how we can respond as an institution to these, as Maura said, sometimes heartbreaking stories. So what has that looked like? Initially, after some of the initial research was published and shared with the campus community, there was a steering committee that was formed. And this was really a grassroots effort. So it included staff, faculty, students, everybody from around the university. But this was not something that was necessarily a leadership initiative. There wasn't necessarily a directive from the chancellor to look into this and make it happen. So the steering committee wanted to come together to look at ways that the university community could respond. And some of those responses have included creating more online presence. So we have a PAC Essentials website that details a lot of on-campus as well as community resources that students can access who are experiencing food and housing insecurity. We have had a food pantry on campus for a number of years, and that started as a student initiative and continues to be very student run and student involved, even as it's continued to grow and kind of get a little bit more institutional support. But through some of the efforts of the PAC Essentials steering committee and other folks on campus, that effort has been able to expand. So it moved into a new space, which had freezer and refrigerator capacity so that they could start offering fruits and vegetables and fresh produce and things like that. We've also created an emergency grants program here at the university, which is typically a $500 grant per student. And that was in place prior to the pandemic, but it just exploded during COVID, both in terms of the generosity of campus partners who were donating to help support that emergency grants program, as well as in terms of the needs that students were requesting support through that emergency fund. We've also had the opportunity to create some meal plan scholarships. So that is an initiative that, again, the university has undertaken and has gotten some private support, as well as a meal swipe donation program. So I work for Campus Enterprises, which manages dining, so I know all the ins and outs of meal swipes and how our meal plan works. But with many of our meal plans, they come with guest meals that students can use for friends or family who are visiting. But many of those go unused. So we created a program where students can donate their guest meals into a fund, which our student ombudsperson can share with students in need. So that can be something that is a very short turnaround, kind of immediate solution to a crisis. If a student, like the student we heard in the video who is living off of a pizza for a week, it's something that we can respond to right away. And another policy change that we've looked at across the university to address housing is try to make sure that our residence halls are open during most breaks for students who need to be there. And that did apply during COVID as well. Even though most of our students left campus, we did have a small cohort who was able to remain on campus if they didn't have anywhere else safe to go. Now, a couple of things you'll notice about this list. These are some fantastic initiatives, and they really represent a lot of hard work and a lot of generosity from supporters of the campus community. They're also a little bit more focused on the food side than the housing side. Housing has been a tougher nut to crack, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And the other thing is that a lot of our efforts are continuing to focus on sort of downstream efforts rather than the upstream of trying to prevent food and housing security from happening in the first place. So thinking about what sort of systems changes might we need to make so that students aren't falling into these crisis situations where they have to be relying on the food pantry or an emergency housing situation, in order to just get by and persist as a student. So that's something that we continue to have conversations with on campus, and I think through Mary's efforts and many other dedicated community members, I think we'll try to keep moving that forward on campus. Now, I did talk a little bit about how housing has been a more challenging issue to address, but we do have something that we are working on that will be a new opportunity to address housing insecurity among college students. And this idea really got started at NC State, but it's not going to be specific to NC State. So we are in the process of launching this program under the umbrella of a local nonprofit. And I'm actually on the board of that local nonprofit, so I'm wearing a couple of different hats with regard to this project. But the host program is going to be a resource that will serve housing insecure students across campuses within Wake County. And how does this work? So a host home program is a program that matches a student experiencing housing insecurity with a community member who is willing to open up their home. So a community member who has a spare bedroom or a small apartment attached to their home, some sort of a private living space that they are willing to offer to create a safe, affirming space for a student to stay. These are meant to be temporary placements while the student can focus on school, but also kind of figure out their longer term plans to have stable, affordable housing. Some neat things about this host home model is that it really relies on relationships. So it creates and helps foster mutually beneficial relationships between hosts and students that honor the needs of all involved. So it's much more personal than other housing programs or shelters or things of that sort that might be a bed and that's about it. This is really an opportunity to be welcomed into a home, which also means that it's a cost-effective way to address housing insecurity, because one of the biggest challenges of housing insecurity is that housing is expensive. So if we're talking about building a facility or something like that, that's millions of dollars. And this is a way to take advantage of infrastructure that's already there, extra rooms that are already in people's homes and maybe just waiting for a guest to show up a couple times a year, but could be utilized to help support a student who's in crisis. So I want to share a little bit more about how the host homes program will actually work. And we'll have some information later about how you may be able to get involved either as a community member or potentially representing the campus that you work at. So some of the expectations of hosts. First of all, hosts are expected to maintain a safe, welcoming, affirming, and non-judgmental environment for their guests. So we want to make sure that our hosts are well screened and well trained to make sure that they really are providing that affirming and non-judgmental environment, and also really well matched. So there will be an extensive process of hosts kind of defining what their particular needs and boundaries are in terms of welcoming someone into their home to make sure that that's a good fit for the student and the host together. And another piece of that is that we want to make sure that we are recruiting as broad and diverse a group of hosts as possible, so that as students are helping go through that match process, and the student has impact into that too. It's not something that is done for them. The student has input into where they feel like it's going to be a good fit, that they have a lot of different potential households to be a part of. Hosts are expected to provide a private space or bedroom in their home. So it does need to be an actual room. We're not trying to encourage couch surfing here. A lot of our students have to fall back on that already, and we want to make sure that they have a more appropriate place to have some privacy and be able to study and things like that. It doesn't have to be an apartment though. It could be a bedroom. So we would ask that hosts would allow a student access to the kitchen and access to a shared or private bathroom that they can use. We'll be looking for hosts who are willing to commit to participating in the program for at least an academic year. although the expectation is that most stays would probably be shorter than that. So a host may potentially have the opportunity to host a couple of different students over the course of that academic year if the match is worked out. But just for continuity of the program, we're looking for people who can make a little bit of that commitment. The host would attend extensive training and interviews, including an in-home interview, so that our team would be able to make sure that it is a safe place for the student to be. And the host would also be expected to define their own expectations, needs, and boundaries. So that may come to things like quiet hours or using kitchen facilities or shared meals, whether or not that's an expectation that the host is comfortable with. If they have children or pets, what are the expectations around that? All those types of issues that may come up. And then hosts are expected to regularly communicate and work with the student staying with them, as well as staff, to resolve any issues promptly to make sure that they don't turn into bigger issues. And then finally, we would do a background check for everyone in the household who is an adult. One thing that we're hoping to be able to provide are stipends, so that if we have hosts who may have the space but may have financial concerns participating because of additional utility costs and things like that of having someone in the home, we're hoping to have stipends available to make sure that finances wouldn't be a barrier for anyone who wants to generously open up their home and be a host. Now, real quick, a couple of things that hosts are not expected to do. So they're not necessarily expected to provide meals, cleaning service, or transportation to the student. This is not a full service hotel stay. Students are expected to be pretty independent members of the family. They're not expected to put up with anything and everything. So that goes back to that defining boundaries and expectations. We want everybody to be respectful of one another's space and boundaries as a part of this process. Hosts are not expected to be a parent. This is not a foster parenting type of role. There may be opportunities for just kind of some natural community building or natural mentorship, but that's not necessarily an expectation. If a host wants to be a little bit more hands-off and just kind of allow that person, the student, to come and go, that's perfectly fine. And that would just be part of the host describing what their expectations are going into it. Hosts do not have to own their home, so we certainly will work with renters as long as it doesn't create problems with their lease or anything like that. Hosts would not be expected to provide financial support to the student other than the free place to stay. And hosts are not expected to have all the answers or be perfect. So we expect that there will be a few little bumps along the road, which there are with almost any kind of roommate or home sharing type of situation. But we plan to offer a lot of support to help get through that. So here's what that will look like is, first of all, there will be an initial contract that will be established between the student and their host family, and that will establish norms and expectations on all sides so that hopefully everybody is very clear about how to make sure that that's a successful relationship. There will be regular check-ins and home visits from our staff. And when I refer to staff, we're hoping eventually, as the program continues to grow, to have 2 different staff members. So a program coordinator who would be available to coordinate the program, as well as answer questions and mediate any problems that come up, kind of work primarily with the hosts. And then the second staff person would be a case manager, and that person would be focused more on the students and helping them to be successful and develop long-term plans. So our host advisory board. So what is the structure behind the scenes of this? So I see some comments in the chat. Yes, so the Be Well organization is a local nonprofit, and we are the host organization for host. So we are the official 501c3 that is helping to coordinate this. But at this stage, when we're just getting the program off the ground and doing our initial fundraising and planning, it's really the host advisory board which is doing the hard work. And this is a totally volunteer group that's doing the hard work of preparing to make this program a reality. So who's on the host advisory board? Well, it includes representatives from educational institutions. So we would like to invite everybody here to consider getting involved in this and promoting it on your campuses so that we can continue to build out the number of institutions who are participating in this. We also have members from nonprofit and community organizations who are a part of this, particularly organizations that work around issues of homelessness so that they can bring their expertise into our work here. As well as we've had a lot of support and guidance from some organizations that support host home programs across the country. This is not a new idea. This is something that has been done successfully with many different organizations around the country. Although to date, it has primarily been done with organizations that serve youth, not necessarily students. So we would be unique in that this would be the first time that the host homes model is being applied specifically to college students in partnership with educational institutions. Obviously, students are really key constituencies. So we have a number of students who have been actively involved in the planning stages and have contributed enormously. And we want to make sure that we're continuing to include and center student voices as we continue to work on this. And then also representatives from business and government. So we want to make sure that we really have broad representation from the community as well as expertise in all of those critical areas. So at this point, we want to invite everybody to participate in some breakout rooms. And we are going to invite you to think about 3 key questions as you head into breakout rooms. We'd encourage you to discuss with one another, what are resources that are available on your campuses to address food and housing insecurity? What are some additional resources that are needed on your campus? And I'd really encourage you to think what we talked about before in terms of those upstream efforts, the prevention types of efforts and things that will really get to the root cause of food and housing insecurity. And then also we want you to think about what questions do you have for Mary and I, and as we come back as a group, we're going to have a chance to address some of those questions. Now, Mary just posted a link to a Google form in the chat, and I think Maura is also going to help us out with reposting these questions so you'll be able to see them even once we're in our breakout rooms. But the Google form is an opportunity for you to fill out your answers to these questions as a group. So if you can designate a member of the group who's got good note-taking skills, hopefully they can jot down some answers, and that'll be really helpful for us to learn a little bit more about what's happening around the CRC institutions, since we're both a little bit more NC State focused. But also that Google form will have an opportunity where you can list contact information if you are interested in learning more about any of the things we discussed today, and want us to follow up with you if you want to get the research or hear more about some of the efforts that are happening on campus or through the host program. We really want to be able to follow up with you. So that will make that easy as well.
Welcome back, everyone.
Awesome. Well, I have popped into a couple different rooms and heard some really good conversations. And a couple of things I just want to invite everybody. I think we had some folks who maybe didn't have microphone capability or quite enough space to be able to contribute in the breakout rooms. But if you have ideas that you want to share, please feel free to use that Google form. Or if you want us to follow up with you, you can add your contact information there. And then at this point, we wanted to leave some time for Q&A. So if you have questions, you're free to unmute and ask your question or put it in the chat or whichever format is more convenient for you, but really open to questions or creative ideas. If anybody heard anything in this discussion that inspired them that they want to share, I'd love to hear it.
I don't mind sharing. My name is Sarah. I work at Wake Tech. I'm actually in a master's program, which is where this idea came from, but there was a study done asking college students about, can they afford basic needs? There's a huge percentage that, couldn't have access to food or housing and things, but 90% of the participants said that they struggle to afford textbooks. So the college that the study was done under was using, I think, like their CARES Act money to pay for a subscription service, provide ebook access to all students, but they were alternatively thinking about including that fee in tuition so that students can have access to textbooks from any location, rather than just having to go to the library to, check it out for 2 hours at a time. But, I think as a college student, I think even in your video, they talked about like, I'm not even sure what these fees go towards, something like ebooks. I think everyone would use, or at least the majority would use that. So I thought it was something worth putting out there to consider if that's a possibility, including those fees where financial aid could cover those costs up front, and it's not an out-of-pocket expense that's burdening students to be able to just do their schoolwork.
It's a great idea, and I love the idea of using CARES funds for that. It's a really creative, concrete way to put those dollars to use for students.
I have a question about some of your research, Dr. Haskett and Annika, about addressing this kind of from the get-go. Has there been any research done at NC State in kind of identifying students that would be at risk for homelessness or food insecurity using FAFSA data? Obviously, there's some privacy laws that come into play there that you may not be privy to some of the information, but has any research been done to work with financial aid to maybe identify some of these students from the get-go?
I love the question because it suggests you're thinking about prevention rather than waiting for students to have to step up in the midst of a crisis. We are not doing a lot in that regard at NC State yet. There is discussion nationally about the use of FAFSA data, and particularly around the experience of homelessness. There's some challenges, as you mentioned, not just with privacy, but FAFSA may help us with students who are entering under some financial duress, but things happen during the school year. Oftentimes students will come in feeling pretty stable and their FAFSA looks like they would have stability, but then life happens. And if students are living just on that cusp of financial security, a medical crisis or a family crisis can often put students at risk in the middle of the year. In addition, that doesn't help us identify graduate students. And we know actually that our graduate students are at greater risk of homelessness than our undergrads, particularly in students enrolled in master's programs as opposed to PhD programs. And that likely has to do with sources of funding for students in master's versus doctoral programs. But yes, we know a little bit about subgroups of students that are most at risk, and that might be an opportunity to think about prevention by communicating with some of those populations of students that we know are at risk. Students who are on the queer spectrum are at greater risk. Students who are international tend to be at higher risk for both food and housing insecurity. I see a message, Wake Tech has something where the student can come in and tell them if their situation is different during the year. For example, parents are refusing to pay for college. So yeah, I was in a breakout group with some folks from Wake Tech who seem to be further along than NC State in terms of reaching out proactively and doing some of that prevention work.
One thing that I might add, and I just learned about this yesterday, so I'm not sure if Mary knows about this yet, but our student health services is going to be adding questions about food and housing insecurity to their initial intake when they are meeting with students. So they are then thinking about how can that not only be a data gathering tool, but then how can they promote referral out to resources. So that's another interesting area, because a lot of these problems do co-occur. So if students may be seeking out counseling services or health support, that may relate to the fact that they are having some basic needs insecurities, and this will be another way to find out about that.
Are there any other questions about this session, or maybe some comments you can make about things happening at your institution that may be beneficial across the 6 CRC campuses? We'll give it a minute to see if anyone else wants to drop a question in the chat if they're uncomfortable coming on camera or using their mic. But I just want to say thank you so much to Annika and Dr. Hesketh. This has been fantastic. I think that sharing any resources that we can across our city, we have 219 faculty and staff members as a part of the cooperating Raleigh colleges and over 110,000 students. So the research that you had done with NC State, I'm sure some of that data and those percentages are very similar across the board, maybe even slightly higher in some of our smaller privates where Pell eligible students may be a bit more rampant. So we appreciate all of your sharing.
Yeah, thank you for, oh, sorry, Annika.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say thanks for allowing us to have this conversation and to learn from you guys. And Annika and I are available on an ongoing basis to talk about these issues if you have questions or ideas about partnership later.